Aizai the Forgotten, the first book in the Soul Wanderers series. To forgotten dreams, forgotten books, forgotten philosophers, and forgotten worlds, may someone find you again. Chapter 1. Some books should be tasted, some devoured, but only a few should be chewed and digested thoroughly. Sir Francis Bacon. In the beginning, there was light, and in the end, darkness. But what happened in between? Wolfden was determined to find out. Indeed, he had made it his duty to discover what had become of that little world, that spark which had fallen into existence for the briefest moment, a piece of stardust landing in the black maw of the sea, its history devoured, but not entirely forgotten. Yet who remembered? Wolfden first heard of the world's existence from an old verse called Aizai the Forgotten. The only portion of the rhyme that anyone remembered was, "The first king, the third king, and then there were no kings in Aizai the Forgotten." There was also the uncommon insult, "May you be as forgotten as Az." Wolfden was one of the few people who knew that Az was rather a more pronounceable version of Aizai. He had spent over a month being what he called a word warrior, seeking out all he could about Aizai. He did not go to school, although he was not from a noble family who felt it necessary that their children travel to the new palace at Versailles and practice the arts of the court rather than learn the classics. No, Wolfden learned primarily through his voracious reading, often causing him to believe that he was far more educated than most 17-year-old boys. His word warrioring consisted of gathering every book that mentioned Aizai, and then sitting up in the musty tower of his aunt and uncle's house to read in dog-ear the brittle yellow pages, from the first rosy blush of sunrise to the herald of the orange evening sun. He would often get them from the library. Although they were not supposed to be taken out of the building, reading them there was not really an option, for whenever he had tried, one or two of a host of unfortunate things was bound to happen. The librarian's daughter might be in the reading lofts by the arched stained-glass windows, haloing herself in the sunlight in a misguided attempt to make Wolfden fall in love with her. Or someone else would want to recruit him for one strange thing or another, the oddest being a man who claimed to be a geological alchemist. Or it might be simply that the librarian was closing up the old building and had found him hiding there. The librarian was quite proficient at searching out the best hiding spots. As a result, Wolfden went to the library wearing his uncle's large woolen coat, into which he had sewn 5 crude pockets, each able to hold at least 2 books. Yet the main library did not hold the most secret books, and these Wolfden had to obtain by more elusive word warrior methods. He would hunt from the roofs of old fortresses or manors, from the depths of the night, until a few hours before sunrise, a time when nobody was yet out for the morning, and late-nighters were finally asleep. He would then descend into the private libraries through their upper windows, wearing his word warrior disguise, a full black mask that he had found outside the Theatre Chevalier, and a heavy black linen shirt with matching loose breeches. With his own boots and dark stockings, it covered all of him save his head and his hands. The mask and a pair of gloves took care of those, completing the disguise. This was ideal for climbing and blending into the darkness, and anyone who caught a glimpse of him would think he was merely the shadow of a cloud. The mask, when viewed up close, was the face of a demonic bird, with a long hooked nose and a layer of obsidian feathers. Wolfden's dark, shoulder-length hair made the disguise even more fitting. On one of these outings, he had obtained his most useful book, The Doctrine of Paulo de la Costa Santa Miguero, translated from Spanish into French by Sir Laurent Sauvage in 1579, about a century ago. This was the only book written by Paulo, and probably the only mention of him in existence. It was compiled by his younger brother, Pepe, who was accredited with only one other book that had not been translated into French or English, entitled Como volar con solo una ala. The other books mentioning Aizai had either been entirely useless, dismissive, with one claiming Aizai was the universal archetype of uncertainty in language, or very brief. The brief ones were dog-eared, such as one book that devoted only a paragraph to Aizai, although still claiming that its shadow was visible off the shores of Santiago in Spain. Wolfton only took this seriously because of the title of Paulo's book. He was reading Paulo's book now, perched upon a moth-eaten cushion in a large semicircular window seat, with his feet across the seat and the book straddling his lap. Outside, grey clouds smudged across the moon like a giant's greasy fingerprints. Paulo had written about the existence of inaccessible worlds. At least, they were nearly inaccessible from our own, much more so than what learned men called the New World, which, when compared to Paulo's worlds, was not so foreign after all. That was, perhaps, why his book was so obscure, for only a few secret societies and hermit alchemists took these things seriously, aside from Wolfton, who read all of their works he could find. Paulo had some fascinating, if not elusive, theories about these worlds and our subtle interactions with them, through a continual flow of what he called soul lines. These soul lines explained various mysterious phenomena, such as the energy associated with certain places, and the connection of minds in vastly different parts of the world. Wolfton read over this part incredulously. Paulo seemed to assume that the reader knew just what he was speaking of, for he did not take so much as an extra phrase to clarify what the strange energy or the connection of minds were. However, although these worlds, which varied from heavenly or demonic realms, other planets and stars, or worlds in the past and future, were far from ours in time and space, there were secret portals on Earth to reach them. Concerning these portals, Paulo said, "Nothing is ever lost, nothing is ever over. It is simply displaced, and anything displaced can be accessed with a proper portal." One thing Wolfton was quite puzzled about was the future realms. He staunchly believed in free will, much more so than most philosophers he had read about, and because he greatly admired Paulo, he decided it must just be a possible future. So he kept reading contentedly. It was just before midnight when he reached the section he had been most excited about. The book was so fascinating that he had decided to read it all, which was not all that time-consuming, since he could read over 700 words per minute. The section was entitled The Forgotten, Aizai, and it consisted of only 4 pages, a treasure trove compared to the other books. Wolfton lit his spare candle and set it to his left in the window seat. He usually didn't light one for fear that the fire would reflect off something and be visible to his sleeping aunt and uncle 3 floors below, but he took the chance that they would not be aroused tonight. A dried fluid had wrinkled the pages, and he smoothed them onto his fingers as he turned the pages. It is remarkable that the realm of Aizai has surfaced in the chronicles of men, for its portal is not, to the best of my knowledge, split between many locations where the soul lines cross. Rather, they all conjoin on the coasts of Santiago. The great magicians sealed in the secret teachings of the dark and light realms have discovered means of entering these portals, and on occasion I have managed it myself. This lore I shall not convey in detail, though most use the methods of hypogony, oculon viewing, or astroglinting. I will explain astroglinting in a subsequent section. Yet the secrets of Aizai lie not in the means of accessing it, for Aizai is one of the few realms dreaming in the seas of the future. And to those with the hearts and minds to bear such information, I do hope that they heed my next words before they fade as Aizai shall one day, like the melody of that lost bird of the Galfordo Sea. For Aizai... Wolfton flinched as a large drop of wax fell onto his arm. His candle was only supported by a rounded brass holder that wobbled whenever he moved. It now took full advantage of Wolfton's sudden movement and toppled into his lap. The pool of wax in the center of the candle gleefully poured out upon the pages of the book. He shoved the candle to the floor, where it was safely snuffed out, swallowed by an invisible beast. But the book was not so fortunate. Although heedless of the waxy burns on his flesh, Wolfton was unable to see anything except sickly tendrils of grey smoke that curled as they faded, as if emerging from the nostrils of a dragon. He furiously tried to brush the wax from his book, while patting out a small fire that had ignited some of the pages. "No, not this part! Not this book!" he cried. He knew he should have read this part first. It was only 4 pages. The fire had left the bottom quarter of about the next 30 pages seared and mostly unreadable. A black grin streaked where the fire had burned across the book. Wolfson couldn't believe it. He blew and rubbed at the ashes, but only managed to make it worse. Never had something like this happened to him before, but then never had he possessed such a captivating book that had so thoroughly blinded him to the machinations of the objects around him. Yet the fire was not the worst of it. The candle had also relieved itself of its wax on the book, and as Wolfson had been putting the fire out, he hadn't the time to get most of the wax off before it seeped through the pages. It had oiled up the paper so that words were displaced, and those that were not completely smudged were jumbled as if they had been spit out after a nice chewing by a dragon. Wolfson was horrified. All this for his overexcitement? It was too much a price after his labours as a word warrior. Yet he was not quick to give up. He used a small knife to cut off as much wax on the surface of the pages as he could, despite the fact that most were sealed together. After some careful chipping, he eventually revived a few phrases. His eyes were heavy with burning sleep, but he forced them open and read what he could. Only something that Plato, another future in that, never shall we, most despicable tendency, astra glinting toward, eaming like, only, and, the pale moon, though gauzed by grey clouds, lulled Wolfson to sleep as the words danced senselessly across his vision. The book fell down upon his lap, and his head lolled onto the cold stone wall behind him as sleep claimed him.